This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Minnesota is known for its Scandinavian roots, which is apparent in everything from the Vikings football team to the Norwegian bachelor farmers of Lake Wobegon. But the state actually has more German than Scandinavian ancestry. So why isn't that German heritage more reflected in the state's culture? Well, it's because much of that German culture was intentionally wiped away around World War I. Reader Shane Loney wanted to know more about what German culture was lost during that period. Here's Shane.
So the reason I asked this question to the Star Tribune is that I've got some German heritage myself. I'm about 50% German. And I'd read some things previously about German heritage being lost during that time. I'd also seen a couple of PBS specials that they had where they discussed different parts of Minnesota that were no longer in existence or had, the buildings had been demolished or the clubs had gone away. And I was curious, with all of the anti-German sentiment with World War II, and of course with World War I especially, what German heritage, what German culture, clubs, restaurants, things like that may have been lost.
Thanks to Shane for that question. I'm chatting today with reporter Greta Kaul, who herself is a descendant of German immigrants who came to Minnesota. Greta wrote a story on this topic for Curious Minnesota. Well, Greta, thanks so much for joining us today. So, first of all, you have German heritage.
I do.
Greta Kaul,
yes.
Kaul. What's your German heritage story in relation to this story?
Yeah, so my great-great-grandfather, Everhard, they would say Kaul. The southern Minnesota relatives say Kaul, but for some reason the ones in the cities say Kaul. I don't know when or how that happened. But my great-great-grandfather was a businessman with like a brick making company in Faribault, Minnesota. So there is still a Kaul block in Faribault.
And did they tell you as a young person, or did your family talk about this past that we're going to talk about today?
So that is interesting to me because I realized reporting this story how little we talked about it. Like, I think I've been aware that we had German heritage for a long time, but we do a lot more of the Scandinavian Christmas stuff, and we talk about our French heritage probably more than our German heritage, which is at least as big, if not bigger.
Right. And so in some ways, what you're describing there is a bit of a microcosm of Minnesota because we're more German ancestry than Scandinavian?
Yes, totally. So contrary to what you might think if you walk into a Minnesota-themed gift shop and see tea towels embroidered with ufta on it or something.
Which is a Norwegian expression.
I think it's, it might be pan-Scandinavian, but it's definitely Scandinavian. Minnesota is significantly more Minnesotans claim German ancestry than Scandinavian.
Oh, okay.
Or Irish, which is interesting too.
Yeah, so we've really erased that part of the state's heritage in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we've downplayed it in relation, I think, to the Scandinavian heritage for sure.
Right. Okay, so let's get into sort of how Germans ended up here. With a lot of this European immigration stories, we end up in the mid-1800s. So mid-1800s, what's going on? We've got Germans coming sort of around the same time that a lot of the Scandinavians are coming as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the same factors are pushing people out of Europe and to places like Minnesota. For people who weren't the firstborn son in their family, they didn't inherit land, and so they were looking for a place to kind of have a better economic future than they had in their home country as those countries were kind of running out of land. In the case of Germany, there was also some persecution of Catholics and Jewish people, and there had been, some political issues that pushed people, especially people who were kind of highly educated and business class type people, out of Germany. And then when we talk about factors that pulled people to the Midwest, a big one is the Homestead Act, because they had pretty easy access to farmland if they could get over here.
Right. Yeah. And we've talked about that in previous episodes. I mean, this is kind of coinciding with removing Native Americans from the land, and then suddenly, white settlement is happening, and it's really cheap for the U.S. government is sort of giving land away to almost, to some degree.
Yep.
And so German enclaves are popping up. Where are some of the biggest enclaves or more notable ones?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty safe to say that New Ulm is still probably the biggest, most concentrated German enclave in Minnesota. But you also have big German populations in places like Shakopee, St. Cloud. Stearns County talks about its German heritage a lot. And also, interestingly, St. Paul. I think people think of St. Paul as more of an Irish town, but it's actually, if you took a time machine to St. Paul in the second half of the 1800s, you would hear German spoken in stores, and there were German-speaking churches and newspapers and tons of beer halls. So it was a pretty German town at that time.
Right. Okay. So we have this German culture that's starting to thrive, and it's a very common thing to hear here in Minnesota. And then in the early 1900s, there's like a nativist contingent that you write about. So what is that, and what's fueling that?
Yeah, so coinciding with this period leading up to World War I, it's the First World War. Americans are watching. Some people in power feel that in this unstable world, having a melting pot country where there are people from all these different places and there are people who kind of retain aspects of their home heritage is potentially a liability for the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so they sort of launched this campaign against hyphenated Americanism, and they really want people to assimilate, speak English, that kind of thing.
Hyphenated meaning like German American or Swedish American.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And also, you note in the story that in 1905, 70% of Minnesota residents, they were either foreign-born or they had foreign-born parents. So there's a lot of people with this sort of hyphenated background, if you will, in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that these forces were not just at work in Minnesota, but they were sort of extra potent in Minnesota compared to other places because there were so many people who were either foreign-born or whose parents were foreign-born.
And so before we get into the war, what are sort of local Germans saying about this war? Because it's a little complicated for them.
Yeah, so this becomes a problem for them because a lot of German Americans, not just in Minnesota, but nationally, are advocating neutrality for the U.S. in the war because they don't want the U.S. to get involved and go to war with Germany. A lot of them still have people that they love back in Germany, right. Because it was not that long ago that a lot of them left Germany. So that is something, there's this atmosphere of nativism in the first place that kind of affects people from all different countries. But then, especially for German Americans, because as we declare war on Germany, we are at war with Germany. Being German American becomes kind of a liability, especially when they had been advocating neutrality leading up to the war. Right.
Okay, so we get into the war, and it's around the same time that the legislature sort of acts to kind of clamp down culture, or sort of what are they doing here? The legislature takes a big step.
Yeah, so pretty much at about exactly the time that the U.S. declares war on Germany and we're at war with them, the Minnesota legislature creates this Public Safety Commission. And its purpose is to basically help the U.S.'s cause in the war. And what it kind of ends up doing is policing patriotism a lot.
And so the governor is on this commission?
Yeah, Governor Bernquist at that time was the chair of the commission and also heavily involved in all this stuff.
Okay. And so what are they doing? How are they policing patriotism? What does this involve?
So it involves a lot of things. One thing that they were concerned with, again, was this nativism. So they had people who were non-citizens register and register their property and things like that. They did pool hall raids to look for draft dodgers, young men of draftable age who might be hanging out in pool halls in the middle of the day instead of working and things like that. Yes.
Okay. Very specific.
Yes,
yeah.
Very specific. Apparently, a lot of German Americans hung out in pool halls.
Sure. And as we know from The Music Man, only weird things happen in pool halls.
Yes.
Anyway.
So they're very focused on, making sure people are supporting the war effort, and especially German Americans in Minnesota are supporting the war effort because they're concerned that they are allied with the Kaiser. And so, they spend a lot of time on German Minnesotans. You could be arrested for speaking German in public and things like that.
Okay. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. Okay, so We have a couple examples of specific anecdotes that you have in the story here. What happened in Laverne?
Yeah, so there's this German-American farmer in Laverne, and the Public Safety Commission kind of had deputized a lot of people around the state to kind of do their bidding. There's like local kind of people affiliated with them that are keeping an eye on the local German-Americans to make sure they're, not doing German things or whatever. And there's this German-American farmer in Laverne whose neighbors apparently didn't think he was supportive of enough of the war bond effort, buying war bonds. That's something they wanted to make sure German Americans were buying war bonds to show that they were supportive. And this guy apparently wasn't supportive enough, so he ended up being tarred and feathered.
Wow. And then around the same time in New Ulm, so they're drafting young men, and this is awkward for the folks in New Ulm. As we said, they were, a lot of the Germans were promoting neutrality. What happens in New Ulm?
Yeah, so in 1918, the U.S. is drafting young men to go off to World War I. And New Ulm is, the leaders and the people of New Ulm are trying to figure out what to do. A lot of them had advocated for neutrality. And they hold this meeting at the Turner Hall, which was this German free-thinking society. The building is still there. You can go get a beer in the Rathskeller in the basement of Turner Hall still. So they hold this meeting. Thousands of people show up, and it's sort of this, like, what do we do about this draft thing, given that some of us don't really want to go fight in Germany against potentially our cousins. And the history books characterize this as the speakers not exactly saying don't sign up for the draft, they're not telling people to draft dodge, but they say, comply with it, but ask to be put in a situation where you're not fighting in Germany or overseas. And the Public Safety Commission does not look kindly upon this, and they come down pretty hard on New Ulm. Basically, Governor Bernquist takes out a couple of their city officials. The mayor and the city attorney are removed from office, pressures the regents of the local college to get the president to resign. A local newspaper publisher gets in trouble. So there's just all kinds of fallout there. The Public Safety Commission sends people after this down to New Ulm to try to gather intel and talk to people about what happened at the draft meeting. And there's this interesting document at the Brown County Historical Society. And it's just this report from somebody who went down to New Ulm to try to talk to people and get people to talk about their feelings about it, and could not get anybody to talk about it. The letter says it was pretty quiet around town.
Yeah, because everybody's scared to death, right?
Yeah, I think it's pretty frightening for them at the time, yeah.
Wow, okay. And so you, in the story, talk about, sort of coinciding with that, there's a lot of culture that's getting erased sort of from the landscape. Physical sort of representations and also sort of schooling. And what's happening as far as how we change the culture around this period?
Yeah, so
which is really what the question is about.
We gave some examples of how German parts of Minnesota were before, and I think it's interesting how quickly some of that disappeared. There were road names that got changed during that time, and public art was removed and things like that. So one example, if you've ever driven down I-35 south, you've probably seen Yankee Doodle Road in Egan. That road's original name was Old Schmidt Road. It was named after a German guy. And there's a couple different stories as to how it happened, but during that era, it was changed from its German name to a very American name, right. Yankee Doodle Road.
And then the Rathskeller was repainted?
Yeah, so this is one that I think more people know about, but the Minnesota State Capitol, which was designed by Cass Gilbert in 1905, has this beautiful German Rathskeller that's now the cafeteria in the basement area. That was designed by Cass Gilbert as this tribute to the state's German heritage in 1905, so not long before all of this happened, right? During World War I, Governor Bernquist orders them to paint over some of the German motifs. So there are kind of these hop motifs and German phrases and things on the walls. It's also temperance, so some of them are drinking phrases. So Bernquist orders them to be painted over. And they briefly reappeared in the 30s. I could not find out why exactly that happened, but they were painted over again and not restored until 1999.
Okay. And there's a photo on the story of people removing a statue in St. Paul of Germania.
Yeah. So there was a Germania insurance company, and it had this building in downtown St. Paul that had a statue of a woman named Germania. So she's kind of the human embodiment of Germany. And that was removed during this period too. Nobody knows. Well, I wasn't able to find anybody who knew where it went. So if you know, get in touch.
But I think we had someone ask about that, right?
Right. Yeah, we did have someone ask about that. So that was removed. They changed the name of the company, so it was no longer named after Germania either. And then there's sort of all this fallout in schools. The Public Safety Commission orders English be the only language that's taught in Minnesota schools. They require schools to stop teaching the music of German composers. So think like Beethoven and Bach and Strauss, pretty big names in classical music during this period.
Yeah. And then beer halls, this sort of falls victim to other forces, but another piece of German culture gets taken out.
Yeah, I think this is a good example of how kind of intersectional things in history can be. But at the same time as all this nativism is going on, there's also the temperance movement that's kind of gaining ground at this time. And so people who are part of the temperance movement kind of look askance at the German drinking culture where people are drinking kind of in public, in beer gardens, on Sundays, heaven forbid. And so at this same time, it doesn't help that a lot of their names are German.
Right.
But from what I was able to glean, Prohibition probably did more of a number on this than this period, but it probably didn't help them that a lot of the breweries were named after the Germans that owned them.
Right. Okay, so after the war, the CPC disbands. Was it sort of like, okay, our work is done, or was there any regrets there?
Yeah, so not long after World War I, one member of the commission wrote that the ruthlessness of the commission's procedure shows how dangerous it is to vest even good men with arbitrary power. He said that they had departed from the principle of constitutional government. So that sounds like he was maybe didn't sit well with him, what they had done.
Right. And then so like moving into World War II, like New Ulm becomes home to a prisoner of war camp?
Yeah, it sounds like the tide really turned for German Americans quickly. You know, a lot of culture got erased pretty quickly in that time. But, you know, in World War II, which was, 2.5 decades later or something like that, New Ulm was home to a German prisoner of war camp. So they let New Ulm, handle these German prisoners of war. So they were apparently not as concerned about them being loyal to Germany by that time.
Wow. And so now New Ulm is like the most German, it claims to be the most German town in Minnesota or America?
America.
In America?
Yeah.
It's a tough thing to back up, but we'll give it to them. Yeah. I don't know how you judge that, but anyway.
It is very German if you have been there.
Did you go there recently?
I did go there recently.
How German is it?
It's pretty German. You pull up downtown, there happened to be polka music playing from some speaker somewhere.
Just always lingering in the
downtown.
Background. If it's going to be so German, yeah.
Yeah, you can get, schnitzel, all the German foods, things like that. You can tour the Shell Brewery. Lots of German stuff to do there. Okay.
So the story came out. Did you hear from anybody afterwards?
Yeah, I think I heard from a lot of people who had kind of similar reactions that I did to this, which is like, I kind of knew that I was German, but I didn't realize what happened to German people in this time period. I also heard from some people who had examples of things that I had missed, German cultural things that had gone away during that time that I did not turn up. So one example of that was there's a town in Carver County called New Germany, and one reader said they changed their name to Motordale, and then changed it. Yeah, a great name.
So simple.
As cars are, becoming a thing.
It's Car City.
Car City, but they changed it back. So.
Okay, so this is still New Germany today.
Yes.
And it was Motordale for some period of time.
Yep.
Fascinating. Well, Greta, thank you so much. This is such interesting history. Something I had sort of gleaned a little bit here and there about, but you kind of put it all in one big package for us, so we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback or a question you'd like us to answer? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.